record.
Thank you for starting the recording. On this slide, you'll see a brief overview of what we'll go over today, including a brief explainer on who we are, our speakers' presentations, a quick discussion, followed by a Q&A. For those of us who are new to webinars on Zoom, you will have the opportunity to ask us questions. So you will have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or at the top, depending on what platform you're using. You have the opportunity to engage in discussion. So there's the chat function. Please make sure you're chatting to everyone and not just one individual. If you'd like to participate and go off mute, you can always raise your hand and we can unmute you when it is time for the Q&A. For those of us who are unable to join us live, the session will be recorded and posted on our website, and the slides will be shared with those of us who have registered. So please make sure you add our email to your contacts, and we will also share it in the chat shortly. We are joined today by two fantastic speakers. So first, we have Miguel Angel Vasquez. Miguel is an award-winning planner with more than 20 years of experience in the public, private, and military sectors. As a planning and health integration expert at RUHS Public Health, Miguel partners with diverse stakeholders to advance planning's impact on health. Next up, we'd like to welcome Senna Catenacci. Senna is a graduate of the University of Michigan with dual degrees in environment and political science. She's currently working at the American Planning Association in Chicago, Illinois, conducting research on APA's grant-funded projects and foresight initiative. Equity has been a focus of her work from the beginning of college and has been through the through line throughout all the roles she's held since. So I asked all of you in the beginning to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from. If you're working at an organization or in school right now, let us know. And also share what justice means to you. And now I'll turn it over to Miguel to share some background on who we are.
Thank you so much, Belinda. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you may be. I want to share with you briefly about FEEL, which is Planning for Health Equity Advocacy and Leadership. FEEL is a set of guiding principles that was developed by over 70 experts from fields dedicated of envisioning, creating, and maintaining our communities, including planning, architecture, engineering, public health, and many others. These experts came from academia, government, the private sector, from community-based organizations in other arenas. FEEL was incubated at my place of work at the Riverside University Health System Public Health back in 2020, at the beginning of that year, as the pandemic was forcing us to isolate and recalibrate our lives. And also during the time when law enforcement officers killed George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And these events informed the content of the FEEL principles. Now, the impetus for this effort was the vision that health equity gained greater prominence in the post-pandemic era as part of what people would describe as the new normal. And I can tell you that this work is making a difference and is achieving that vision, but the systems that benefit from inequities are very strong and very powerful. And for this reason, we need to keep reimagining, reorganizing, and repositioning ourselves to persist until we eradicate the systems that perpetuate health inequities. To that end, we started a community of practice with a network of health impact assessment practitioners. And also, we started the Health Equity in Planning Interest Group at the American Planning Association to continue to advocate for the integration of health equity considerations into planning policy and practices. You may know that APA is one of the sources of our targeted audiences, urban planners, And they're also the source where real impact actually happens, because this organization is highly influential in the thinking, in the practice, and the art of urban planning. APA is a great champion and supporter of integrating health into our planning practices. And recently, I came across the dimensions of equity, quick notes number 105, authored by Sena Catenacci. And I was so excited to see that, because just around the time when I saw that publication, we had just completed a framework to understand what justice means for the kind of work that we do in public health, which is highly connected to health equity. So during the next 20 minutes, we are going to share those two examples of how we have dissected the ideas of equity and justice for you to consider it. But before I turn it over to Sena, if there are a couple of people who would like to say what justice means to them, and I think Belinda, you could probably unmute them, or can they unmute themselves?
I will have to unmute them, but let me see
Okay,
if there's anyone who wants to raise their hand to participate. I'm checking in the attendee list right now.
excellent. Thank you, Belinda.
Of course. Any brave souls out there who want to share? Oh, we have one volunteer, Nishito. I'm going to unmute you right now.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. To me, health equity is livability, and that anyone, regardless of their identity, has the opportunity to lead a livable life.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nishita. Do we have another idea?
No one else's hand is raised, so I think we can move on to Senna.
Excellent. So with that, Sena, you're on.
Okay, hello. Again, my name is Senna. I work at APA National. And recently, as Miguel said, I wrote a report for APA as part of our planning advisory service. And just to give a quick overview, if you're not familiar, APA has something, PAS, our planning advisory service, and we publish different reports and things on a variety of topics, sometimes based on member interest, sometimes based on internal research. We have reports, memos, and quick notes. What I wrote was a quick note, and these kind of serve as a very quick reference for it condenses a big topic into something very short. This was only 2 pages to kind of serve as a jumping off point for people to get high level overview of a topic and then provide resource so that they can go and do more research on their own. So as I said, this one is on the dimensions of equity. There are a lot of, obviously, equity is like a very big concept. For the purpose of this report, I kind of distilled it down into 5 different types. You may hear terms that are like different than what you're used to. Maybe they're the same. There's a lot of overlap in this field, but this is kind of how I framed it. If you're an APA member, you'll have access to this for free. But if not, I'm going to try and give as thorough of a description as possible so that you can still get a good basis for it. So to start, I will go over kind of just the definitions broadly of equity that I have. So the first type of equity is structural. And this kind of entails both a recognition and remediation of past practices that created an inequity to begin with. Sometimes you may have heard this just as recognitional justice, but structural kind of also entails that second component where not only do you acknowledge that something is wrong, but that you make efforts to fix it. Procedural is kind of what it sounds like. It is the wide inclusion of all groups that are affected by a proposed decision. So in a community, that's just including everyone from the community You want to make active outreach and make it as widely accessible as possible. Cultural equity is kind of a form of procedural equity, which focuses specifically on arts and cultural programming. So this kind of focuses particularly on historically underserved populations, but including of all, and trying to make the policies and programming for this field as accessible, again, to everyone as possible. There's distributional equity, which is kind of probably one of the more commonly known ones, but this is just the fair allotment of benefits and burdens across an area, making sure that you're targeting places that are historically underserved, et cetera. And then lastly, we have intergenerational equity, which again, this is kind of a form of distributional equity, but looking at it through time. So ensuring that the decisions that are made today don't negatively impact people in the future. And this is kind of similar to the notion, like the traditional notion of sustainability. And then moving on, so kind of the next section is how to address these different types. This is like, again, it's very high level. You can write like a full-length report on each of these things. So there are kind of a lot of ways to do it. This is what I was kind of describing. Very broadly for structural equity. The first thing is just to promote understanding within an organization, agency, whatever it is, of the need to have like this acknowledgement. It's kind of the thing where it's necessary but not sufficient, but you at least need a basis of people to understand. So this may be like tools or trainings, however you want to do it, and then going on to change the culture of the agency to be more in line with the goals that you want to achieve. For procedural justice, this is kind of it feels like it should be the easiest one, but it isn't always done that way. But again, very simply, you just need to provide a lot of opportunity for people to engage. You need to have community engagement to begin with. And then you just need to make sure that you're cognizant of different people's schedules or restrictions and limitations. So this can be having community meetings at different types of day, different days of the week, different locations within a community, just trying to make it as accessible as possible, making sure that people are aware that this is even happening to begin with. For cultural equity, this is kind of a like understanding that you have to build amongst community members and seeing how they experience culture and arts, how this varies between different groups in a community, kind of going out and making partnerships with local organizations, and that kind of trust building component that needs to be not just like a one-off, but an ongoing thing. For distributional equity, this is where kind of the bulk of the analysis tends to be. You have just both quantitative, qualitative data collection and analysis. A lot of the qualitative stuff will also probably come from like the community engagement component of whatever you're trying to do. And mapping that out, seeing again, like where people are lacking in an area, where things can be moved around to better accommodate, so on. And then lastly, for intergenerational, this one can seem almost kind of like a meditation almost, but it's kind of you training yourself to think with like a foresight thought. And there are different ways that you can kind of do this. There are different resources. I know the United Nations has a couple of things in terms of like relevant to climate change, like thinking like common principles for the future, things like that. Just making sure that you keep these things in mind. So lastly, I know this is kind of like a lot very quick. It's a lot to condense down. There's a lot to condense down into 2 pages. I kind of wanted to run through a little example. So this report is geared towards planners. Obviously, it's applicable to everyone, like a public health webinar. But I kind of took the example of a group of city planners who are building or want to build a new local park. and they want to not repeat past mistakes, have kind of equity at the forefront. So they start and they want to kind of be sure that internally, like an internal validation, that they're on the right track. So perhaps they hire a consultant that specializes in equitable development and work with them to kind of get their priorities, establish awareness within the team, so on, to have like the right intentions in mind and then to be able to reach them. So this is kind of a form of structural equity. Again, these are all examples. There are a lot of ways you can approach this. But so say that you have this, your team is all on the same page, you know what you want to do. You need to then choose where you want to build the park. So you know that from data analysis that the lower income neighborhoods have half as much green space as the wealthier ones. So you only consider the former when you're designing or deciding where to put the park. So this is kind of that, oops, sorry, that distributional component of it. And now that you know where you want to put the park, you need to figure out what you want to put in the park. So this is where you can kind of start to engage the community, figure out what they're lacking, what would most benefit them. Maybe you have surveys and workshops and community mapping and things like that. A variety of things, as I said, all different times of the week. Different, you can use both like digital, paper format, trying to reach as wide of an audience as possible. And make it enticing for them to come. Maybe you have like food and music, things like that. So this is your procedural component. Sorry. And then, so now that you have that, you kind of want to augment the park, have some arts programming there. That's where you can kind of engage local community organizations to maybe build like a sculpture or a mural that is representative of the history of the area. That can be like your cultural component of it. And then lastly, in order to maintain the park for the future, make sure that it continues to serve the needs of the community, you can perhaps establish a community board that consists of people from all different ages that can inform and help the maintenance of the park adapt as the community adapts. So that is, in a nutshell, what I have. The through line is that there are a lot of places where equity can come into play, and it is kind of on you to figure out where that is, but it's in actuality not so difficult to do. But thank you very much. I will pass it back to Miguel.
Thank you so much, Sina. What I have to share now is going to be to some extent similar to what you described, but it has a different spin. And it's just amazing that you and I in different places were thinking about the same thing around the same time, and we came up with these ways to explain how to dig a little deeper into the work around health equity. So I like to begin by showing these illustrations, and I'm pretty sure that many of you are familiar with them, and you've seen in different websites and publications and presentations, and they are illustrations intended to initially differentiate the ideas between what equality is and what equity is. My very first encounter was actually with the first image at the top left. It was during a presentation by my good friend and colleague Beth Altschuler, who was sharing it during a presentation she was giving about 10 years ago, in around the time when I was starting my own journey in the space of health equity. Now, when you look at them closely, these are metaphors that force us to question imbalances in our systems that may be disguised through the notion of equality. And also, it gives us an image of what needs to be done to correct those imbalances through an equity approach. Now, while they're all different, the idea is the same. But the last image, however, is a little bit more descriptive, and it introduces the idea of justice. And if you see, it's a little hard to read, but when they talk about justice in that illustration, it reads that fixing the system to offer equal access to tools that address inequalities and opportunities. In the past few months at my place of work, again, the Riverside University Health System Public Health, we have been centering our internal and external approach around justice. For instance, we have an equity and justice committee and also an environmental justice task force. In an effort to understand the dimensions of justice and to define our explicit involvement in issues affecting health outcomes, we created the framework that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So let's see if I can move my slide forward. Maybe I will ask Belinda to advance it for me. Was that me or was that you, Belinda?
That was me.
Okay, excellent. So this is our first slide. And what I want you to get from this slide is that if you think about it, the notion of justice is everywhere. We hear it really on a daily basis, especially in the type of work that we do in public health. And sometimes it comes through the ideas of people working on sex and gender justice. I mentioned environmental justice. There's others working on political justice, climate justice, and so on and so forth. But what exactly does that mean? So the framework that I will be walking you through to the left of the screen has 4 layers that will help us to dissect that idea of justice and start seeing patterns that can help us to be more effective as we embrace the work of working towards justice. So first, in the model, we identified 3 players or entities. They are the offended, the offender, and the moderator. The moderator is, we could say that is who decides what's right. And the entities can be individuals, institutions, corporations that are connected through actions and or inactions. Next slide. The next layer contains 4 types of justice. And Sena already went through those types, which are actually components of equity. But just to reinforce what we found when we created our model, we identified that justice can be distributive, and that means giving all members of society a fair share of the benefits of resources available. And then we have restorative justice, which is concerned with healing the victim's wounds and restoring the offenders to law-abiding lives and repairing harm done to interpersonal relationships and the community. And then we have retributive justice, which indicates that people deserve to be treated according to fair processes that ensure fair treatment. In this type of justice has 4 components. Next slide.
You can move the slides now, Miguel.
Oh, let's see. I don't think I did that.
Try clicking on the
No.
screen.
It's not moving.
Okay, I can do it.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
They are fairness, which means being fair in processes with dignity and respect. Voice, providing opportunities for all parties to speak. Impartiality, in which the moderator is a neutral player. And transparency, which is full visibility in all processes. In other words, it means trustworthiness. Next slide. For this slide, you will see a triangle, and that's the 3rd layer. And in our work as health equity advocates, often we find ourselves working on addressing systems, policy, and environmental change to improve health outcomes. It is important to be reminded about those three domains to be able to strategically center ourselves as we work towards justice. Next slide. The last layer, oh, can you go back, please? The last layer contains the most obvious human considerations that connects all dimensions of identity with opportunities to thrive and live lives that are free of disease, danger, and persecution. They are belonging, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And without these considerations of this layer, our path towards justice can be nebulous and fuzzy. It's really important to always keep those in mind. Next slide. Now, I like for us to turn the table around and let's forget about justice for a minute and center ourselves in the notion of injustice. They're the same, but they're different things when you think about it. And this means that this idea can help us become more specific about what we are doing or what we want to do to improve, let's say, health justice, for instance. Next slide. Now, as a planner, I'm trained as a generalist, which means I have different competencies and levels of expertise on the application of urban planning principles into any social, political, economic, and environmental issues. And I can assure you that justice is not easy to achieve, is not easy to maintain, and is not easy to shift, because justice is multidimensional, just like our everyday lives. We don't live a one-dimension type of life. There's many things that converge throughout our day, and it's the same thing with the ideas of how different systems come together. And all these systems do have problems that need to be addressed. So we need to think in terms of, first, when we think about justice and injustice, we need to think about justice for who. It's really important to keep that in mind. And then once we determine who may be experiencing an injustice, which may be an individual, a community, a corporation, or even a nation, then we need to look at where we may be in the spectrum of justice and injustice. We may be at a point where injustices are too deep and entrenched. And when we identify that, you know that it will be much work, much harder to get us towards justice. But we need to define, okay, so where are we at within this spectrum of justice? And to help us assess that, it's absolutely necessary that we have access to data and stories to help us define our position and move accordingly. And to conclude, I want to say that we named this framework as Centering Injustice Framework for Liberation Advocates. And the reason for this is because anyone working towards justice truly is working on dismantling systems of oppression and is working towards replacing those systems with systems of dignity, opportunity, and fairness. And that is actually the definition of a liberation advocate. And I suspect that most of you in attendance are liberation advocates and practitioners. This model is for you. And always remember that equity is the path towards justice. And with that, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Belinda.
Now we're going to move on to the discussion section of our webinar, where each of our speakers are going to ask each other questions about their models and quick notes. Turning it back to you both.
Well, maybe I can start asking you one question, Sena.
Sure.
These sort of things don't happen just out of the blue. It's not like you said, oh, I want to work on the dimensions of equity, and bam. They said, oh, yeah, that sounds great right away. I suspect that there's a process and there's also a foundation. Can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking and those sort of pieces assisted you in getting you to where you're at?
Yeah, for sure. So kind of the process, for PAS like reports in general, we use a variety of sources to kind of figure out, like there's the editorial team at APA has like a whole like schedule and everything. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that even I don't really know. But like for something like this, kind of the quick notes in particular are meant to be, as I said, kind of quick references on topics that maybe we like implicitly, like APA has like implicitly reported on, but it's not, maybe it hasn't been like its own dedicated thing yet. So like, for instance, when we were deciding on this, there's a list of topics. Sometimes it's things that are raised by like our membership base. And then sometimes it's things, as I said, that comes out of like various other internal projects that we have. So for example, every year APA publishes like a big trend report, which is meant to be kind of encapsulates like a lot of things that are happening in a lot of different fields. So sometimes we'll pull topics on there. Like I just wrote another thing about geoengineering. So for this one in particular, it was kind of something that we've been wanting to have like its own like platform for a while, but it just hadn't been done yet. And I think it was also partly like APA, like as an organization, like it's kind of similar, like where there's a lot of like equity work that we do, but it's not always named explicitly as, oh, this is like an equity thing that we're doing. So it's kind of, we're like making our own thing to kind of be more like open and transparent about that. So I think this was kind of coming out of that as well. So there are a lot of things that come into it, but yeah.
That's great.
Yes, I'm wondering for you,
Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. I was just saying, I'm wondering for you, kind of similar, the various inputs that you use, like to develop your model, like, was it like mostly like coming from your own work? Was it like research, like broadly, or like how did you like start developing it, and like where did you pull from to do so?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it's been a journey. When I started working at the Department of Public Health, which was in 2011, I didn't really know much about equity until somebody mentioned it during a meeting, and it was actually a young person who was talking about the difference between equality and inequity. So since then, I began to learn more about the importance of integrating an equity lens, if you will, into our work. And over the years, I've been part of different collaboratives, and including the APA Diversity Task Force, which eventually became the DI committee. I chaired that group for some time. I participated in the development of the Planning for Equity Policy Guide. So all these opportunities have been informing what I do as a professional. And recently, I found myself at the point where were really talking about justice. And I started questioning, whoa, okay, I haven't really worked on justice. So what does that mean? So I was at a meeting with, I think it was at the time, or environmental justice had a different name at the time, but justice was part of the name of that task force. And they were talking about different projects that they were working on related to, I don't know, transportation justice or climate justice. And it just sort of became a little too cumbersome to understand. Well, what is it exactly that people are working on and interested in doing with the Department of Public Health? So I took the opportunity to have an understanding of what that could be, and that was the beginning of developing the framework. At some point, I was able to share an initial sketch of what the layers that I showed in a different way. They were bubbles at the time, but still there were layers that were integrated, and people were very receptive to that idea, and they wanted me to share it, but I was like, okay, this is great, but let us put a little more thinking into it. So we began to do some research. I had an opportunity to work with a Civic Spark fellow, Nabiha Saeed. She was my fellow at the time, and she helped me to do the research and put it together. So that was really the process that we went through, and then we presented it to the um, Health Equity and Justice Committee, which validated that it was a model that we wanted to have to inform how we move forward. Now through field, we have now another opportunity which is happening right now, which is to put it out there for people to consider. And as a matter of fact, I like to invite anybody who would like to provide us with their feedback. And if they want to be part of a group of peer reviewers so that we can finally publish it formally. It is not necessarily available anywhere. We will share it with the slides and obviously with the webinar, but we like to get to the point where we can make it widely available. So that is part of the process. Is not fully completed. This is one opportunity to get us to that point.
Very cool. I feel like that's kind of like emblematic of the field as a whole, where it's like it's something that's like never done. It's like very much an ongoing thing all of the time. Even like developing models or using them, like you've never really exhausted it.
Yeah, exactly. So I am curious about how if APA is planning to just keep the quick notes for members only, or if you are planning to make it more accessible to a wider audience, if you're planning more webinars, or what's the plan to continue to disseminate?
So as I said, kind of like the PAS stuff is usually like for members. But I know there are different ways, like a lot of times it like ends up manifesting at like NPC, like our National Planning Conference. I know last year there was an APA chapter presentation that actually mentioned this report. I was very flattered, but so it will probably be like a multimodal thing where it goes out, like I said, like at the conference and webinars, etc. I don't know exactly what like the future of it will look like. That's kind of, again, like often the editorial side of things, and I am only in the research department. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, I hope, like I would love for it to kind of get as wide of an audience as possible, because obviously it's like very important work, and it's kind of like what the report is talking about anyway. But yeah, we'll see.
Thank you.
Yeah. One last question I guess I have for you right now. Do you have, again, like kind of forward looking, do you have any plans for like once you do kind of like fully flesh out the model and everything of how you'll use it going forward? Will it be kind of like a presentation tool, or like will you apply it in other ways as well?
Yeah, I think, well, somebody reached out to me yesterday to see if I wanted to share this model at a conference called the People's Public Health Conference. I have never heard of it before. So I'm like, oh my gosh, this would be amazing. So finding opportunities to continue to share this framework, because I think it's important for people who may want to be more strategic about how they allocate their time, their resources, their capacity, and be more focused, because again, it's really big. The animal is big and he has many arms, many eyes, and we can only, I guess, tackle the animal if we collectively have a strategy. I think we're coming from many different directions and it's effective to some extent, but I think that understanding is really essential. So taking it out there for more people to use it, to think about it, feel the planning for health equity advocacy and leadership. The more I think about it, it's sort of space for thinking about these ideas and these issues that sometimes we don't have time to ponder because we're so entrenched into saving people when it's too late. So we need to figure out ways strategically to work upstream and prevent more people to fall into despair, into not having opportunities to be as healthy as they can.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. Like my background is in environment and I do a lot of work at APA with like hazard mitigation stuff. And that's like a big focus. And like a lot of people are talking like we need to be more proactive rather than reactive. I think, yeah, that's very much true here as well.
I love what both of you have said, and thank you so much for having this great discussion. I just thinking about what Miguel just said and Senna, what you just said, all this upstream impacts that we must do. That's kind of why I wanted to also study public health, being able to figure out the root cause in order to identify solutions to create healthy communities. Thank you so much to you both for taking the time out to present your models and your quick notes. We are now moving into our Q&A session, and I know that there are some questions that have come in. We have time for a few more if anyone else wants to drop in their questions in the Q&A box. But let's start off with one from an anonymous attendee that says, what are some ways the framework is being operationalized at the health department? I believe that might be a question for Miguel.
Right. Well, I think at this time, for instance, I mentioned we have an environmental justice task force, and it's brand new. They just branded themselves as such. In our county, we have quite a bit of environmental justice issues. And sometimes you see, I want to say environmental injustices, but I don't have right now, data to tell you. We have mapping systems that can show us where people in our county are more disadvantaged than others, and when they experiencing more exposures to harmful um, elements, like air quality, or not having clean water, or the deficiency of affordable housing. So we are not necessarily fully in operation. We are, I guess, in a sense, it wouldn't be fair to say that we're getting started, because we have been building capacity until we can see ourselves and say, whoa, okay, we want to work on environmental justice. How do we focus on an issue, and who do we need to work with? Because obviously our task force can't do it all. And environmental justice is multidimensional. It has to do with air, water, and soil. So we're just getting started in that front, and more to come. But this is, again, a way for us to be able to focus on where we want to put our resources.
Thank you, Miguel. We have another question from Gina, and I wanted to know whether, Gina, you'd like to go off mute and ask the question yourself. If you do, please raise your hand and I can unmute you. If not, I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf. Okay. Okay, so Gina has asked, hi all, are there any existing examples speakers or attendees can share where you've operationalized movement toward justice or addressing injustice in your work?
I have an example, and I don't have the link, but hopefully I'll have time to Google it and share the link. But I think afterwards we will include some resources when we post the webinar. There is this project called Biking While Black, and it was developed by bicycle advocates from LA, from the city of Los Angeles. And if you look at their work, and they actually have a toolkit on how to go about addressing injustices that you may find on the street environment, when your sidewalks may be broken, where you may not have bike lanes, when you may have dangerous intersections. And it's just an amazing document that I wanted to highlight. I can't remember the full name of the person who led the project. Her first name is Yolanda, but I can't remember her last name. But I think that is an absolute amazing model of how to operationalize the idea of equity and justice into active transportation. I believe their work was made possible actually by a metropolitan planning organization, which is the Southern California Association of Governments, through a program that they have been managing for a number of years called the Go Human campaign. So what is really beautiful about this example is that you have advocates in government collaborating to the extent possible. And SCAG is a quasi-government organization, it's the, again, Metropolitan Planning Organization. They don't necessarily have much jurisdiction, but they represent our local governments, and our local governments trust the content that SCAG generates to inform them how to address inequities, if you will. So I encourage you to check that out, Biking While Black. And I believe there's a website that has videos and their stories and the toolkit that I mentioned.
One example that I can share, it's kind of minor and it certainly only addresses like one component of what we've been talking about, but APA has several projects where we have some kind of like advisory panel or like a task force or something where we recruit people. Sometimes they're from our membership, sometimes they're not, about whatever like projects we're working on. So for example, I mentioned like we have the trend report. We have a group of people who kind of tell us like things they've been noticing in their field. We have another project with FEMA right now, which is kind of focused specifically on climate adaptation and hazard mitigation, and it's kind of a similar thing. So when we conduct outreach to like build these groups, we try to be like very cognizant about addressing like or like contacting a variety of people, like not just again like staying only within our membership or only staying within like one demographic. We're kind of trying to make sure that like like it helps like everyone, and it helps us like if we have as many perspectives as possible. So that's one way that we've been kind of like moving or incorporating that into various projects at APA.
Thank you both. We have one last question from Jamie. So this question says, these frameworks certainly speak to the goal many of us planning and or public health practitioners have of embedding health equity and justice into our day-to-day work. What tangible first steps would you recommend? Do you have any examples of implementing health equity and justice into on-the-ground projects?
Yeah, I can start. I think the first steps are actually pretty simple. You know, I mentioned that it's very big and difficult and the animal and blah, 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 right? Well, that is true. And I think Sena also mentioned that is alluded to the idea that it's not too difficult also to address inequities in the sense that, for me, from my experience, is relationship building. And relationship building is not just calling somebody because you need something at the time when you're doing a research project or when you're working on a grant application. That doesn't really work when you are trying to, I don't know, extract things for your own benefit. It begins by genuinely meeting people, mainly the people you are trying to help, and building relationships, listening to them, spending the time to the point where they can see that you are really, truly there to help them, to assist them, because, you know, for us working in government, our work is to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare. But sometimes we forget to actually spend time with the people we want to help. And the I would say the secret recipe to building relationships actually begins with the action of what some people refer to as breaking bread. You go to lunch, you share time to get to know one another while enjoying a meal. That would be the first step that I would say if anybody's like, okay, so what do I do, or what can I integrate into my practice, is go to lunch with people, find ways to connect.
Thank you so much, Miguel. I know that Miguel and Sena have such good advice to share with us very shortly. But right before we wrap up, I'd love to invite everyone who are still online to share in the chat, what is one new thing you learned from this webinar? I know we learned so much, but if you could condense it down to just one thing, please share it in the chat. And while you all do that, I'm going to invite Sena to share her concluding remarks, followed by Miguel.
Sure. So I just have read it, but kind of the things that stand out to me the most in preparing for this, and just in general, things that I think about this topic. Even, and this is kind of what I've alluded to before, but even if you're already incorporating equity implicitly into your work, it's still really important that you name it explicitly. Like I said, this is what APA is trying to do. This is kind of like equity in itself, because it's important, like here, like others can learn what you've done, and they have like I think a lot of people know these things, but it doesn't always click until they have like a term for it. Next, this type of work especially lends itself to collaboration. I know Miguel said this earlier, because we're all kind of approaching these things with like a certain perspective and set of biases that may preclude us from learning about other things. So kind of the same thing, like just talk with as many people as possible from as many perspectives, see what you can learn. And equity obviously encompasses a lot. You've said this as well, but it does not have to be intimidating. That's why part of what I want to do, like with this, is like just like break it down into different types and applications, make it as manageable as possible. And then this will help you in kind of incorporating it into your work.
Miguel?
And I just have these ideas, and I think I already mentioned that equity is in the path of justice. So to be able to get there, we need to have a good sense of what that means. And I think Sena's framework really helps us to understand the components, because equity can help us prevent, mitigate, and eliminate injustices. Is that, the full spectrum when we think about the idea of working upstream and working downstream. At any point in time, we need to use that equity framework. I think it is important to think about the idea of when we say, yeah, I'm working on justice. I think it's important to identify, well, what injustices specifically are we trying to address? And it's not only identifying them, but as part of that analysis is to understand how we got there. So what happened? Because that may be a pathway to identify where we need to troubleshoot to make it better. And finally, policy is absolutely essential in this work. And when I think of policy, there is the notion of good policy and bad policy. The policies that exist, the policies that exist that may be good or may be bad. So the good ones, you want to keep them. The ones that are bad, you need to revisit them and recreate them. But there's also the new ones that we need to create. So the opportunity for developing policy that fits our time in our moment is a great opportunity. And building relationship with legislators, elected officials is just as important. And some of you may actually some of you in the room, I know at least somebody is an elected official who ran because she wants to make the system better. So there you have it.
Thank you so much, Miguel. And thank you so much, Sena. Thank you, APA California Planners for Health. Thank you to all the attendees who participated in this webinar for your time today. We have made it right on time. As a follow-up, we will be sending an email with a copy of our slides. The recording of our webinar will be posted on our website very soon. If you'd like to stay involved, we'll give you some examples of how you can stay in touch with us. We also launched a very new website. Thank you, Christiane. She might still be on the webinar right now. She designed a beautiful website. You can check us out at PHEAL.us. We're also on LinkedIn and Instagram, and we invite you to join our community. Thank you so much for your time today. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.